Good afternoon. As you all might recollect, that I've already had a discussion on some of the theories of international trade, and I basically discussed the theory of absolute advantage and the theory of comparative advantage. In other words, we are looking at the theory of absolute advantage, which is by Adam Smith, and the theory of comparative advantage, which is by David Ricardo. Just to recollect, the theory of absolute advantage basically emphasizes the fact that countries which have an absolute cost advantage in producing a particular commodity will specialize in the production and export of those items in which they have an absolute cost advantage. If you recollect, I discussed a case of two countries, India and Bangladesh, and they were manufacturing two products, rice and wheat. And clearly, I summarized the scenarios under which Bangladesh would export a particular commodity and India would export a particular commodity. And what is important is the absolute advantage mentions that countries which have an absolute cost advantage in the manufacturing of a particular item, then the country would specialize and export those goods in which it has an absolute advantage. And also similarly, countries which have an absolute disadvantage in terms of cost of production or man hours involvement, if it's labor as a raw material, in producing a particular good, the country would import that. So import of goods in which it has an absolute disadvantage and export of goods in which it has an absolute advantage. Next came an improvement to absolute advantage concept. Now, absolute advantage is by Smith, Adam Smith, whereas comparative advantage is by Ricardo. Ricardo said that what happens? Now, he came out with this concept of comparative advantage. Now, he gave a scenario, Ricardo said, that if a country A, now suppose you have two countries, country A and country B, and there are two commodities, X and Y. X and Y are two commodities. So given two countries A and B and two commodities X, Y, X and Y. Now Ricardo said, suppose country A has an absolute advantage in both commodities. In that case, where is trade? The big question is, where is trade in this case? Because then, as per the theory of absolute advantage concept, country A would specialize in production of X and Y and export X and Y. A particular country A would then produce and export X and Y. But then in that case, there is no trade with B, because B has an absolute disadvantage, whereas country A has an absolute advantage in both commodities. So under this scenario, there is no trade between A and B, because B has an absolute disadvantage in terms of cost of producing X and Y as compared to producing X and Y by country A, which has an absolute advantage. In that case, Ricardo came out with this concept of comparative advantage. And there he mentioned, which I've already discussed in details, please go back to my previous presentations, where I've clearly said that suppose A has an absolute advantage in both. and B has an absolute disadvantage in both. That's perfectly fine. That can happen. But what happens in case of trade? Now, Ricardo says that out of the two goods X and Y for country A, it produces, say, X relatively more efficiently than Y. I repeat my words, relatively more efficiently. So if country A produces good X relatively more efficiently than what country B does, or what he can do in the case of commodity Y, then X would produce an export, then country A would produce and export good X. Country A would produce and export good X. Country A would produce and export good X if it produces X relatively more efficiently. Similarly, country B would produce and export good Y, which it can do relatively more efficiently as compared to country A. Or, for that matter, in the case of X and Y. If it is producing X and Y, it produces Y relatively more efficiently, and it somewhat has an advantage over country A. So therefore, the basic logic here is that in the case of two countries where there's an absolute advantage and absolute disadvantage, there are no gains from trade. But Ricardo came out with a very unique concept of comparative advantage and said that country A or country B would produce and export those commodities which it can produce relatively more efficiently. In other words, it has a comparative advantage over another commodity. It can produce a good X in comparatively more efficiently than it can for good Y. And that is the basic criteria here on the basis of which trade is promoted. Now, an extension of these two theories came. Now this, today my lecture would now emphasize on the modern or the contemporary approaches to trade. I'm looking at trade theories, but more modern, more sophisticated, more advanced versions, which are recently international trade theories. My discussion today primarily will be confined to the various international trade theories, where famous economists have suggested that trade would occur between two nations, provided certain conditions are fulfilled. So it's basically on certain criterias. If there are two countries and two goods and two factors of production, in that case, country A would trade in a particular good, and country B would also trade in a particular good based on certain criterias and conditions and riders being fulfilled. I repeat, trade would occur between two nations, provided certain conditions, certain criteria, and certain riders are completed and fulfilled successfully. So as an extension to the theory of absolute and comparative advantage, we would now move on to the contemporary trade theories. It goes like this. Now the first trade theory I will discuss is given by, the third one is by Haberl. I repeat, oh sorry, this is H-A-R. H-A-R, Haberl. It's a little clumsy. Let me settle this down. It is by Haberl, who came out with a new modern concept of international trade. Now what Haberl says is, now Haberl's version is an improvement over Ricardo. And Harbalal goes on to say that trade would occur between two nations if the two nations differ in terms of opportunity costs. Ladies and gentlemen, let me put this in bold. This is the basic condition to be fulfilled for trade to occur. He said it is the differences in opportunity cost structures which promote trade. Opportunity costs, the differences in opportunity costs which constitutes the basis of trade. In other words, trade would take place where price are determined by opportunity cost differentials. In other words, it's the differences in opportunity costs which would determine the prices which, on the basis of which trade takes place between two countries. Again, country A, country B, two goods, X and Y, X and Y. So Harbalal goes on to explain that trade would take place between country A and country B based on the shape of the production possibility frontier. It is the shape and structure of the production possibility frontier which gives an indication of what the opportunity cost structures would be. In other words, this is point number one. The shape of the production possibility frontier would tell you the nature of opportunity costs. And it's the opportunity cost differentials which would say that how, on what price ratios would trade takes place between the two countries. So PPF, opportunity cost differentials, prices, trade. Now, what Harbalal is saying is that comparative advantage, Ricardo said that it was the cost difference which made trade possible. That it was differences in costs, relative efficiency of two goods by country A or country B. In other words, country A would produce a good comparatively more efficiently at a cheaper cost. So it's cost difference which would promote trade. Whereas Harbalal is saying that it is not the cost difference but the opportunity cost differentials. It is the opportunity cost differentials which would determine the prices, and on the basis of prices, trade would take place across nations. So therefore, what I would like to say under this consideration is, now let us see what is a production possibility frontier and what is an opportunity cost differential. What do we mean by these two terms? Now I would like to begin an explanation between the production possibility frontier. Now production possibility frontier is a curve. Let's draw a curve here. Let's call this ZW. We have a production possibility curve of, say, country A, where horizontally we are measuring good X and vertically we are measuring good Y. Now the production possibility frontier ZW shows that there are various combinations of good X and Y which can be produced. Now let's look at the diagram again. Here you have y0, y1, x0, x1. So let us look at the market with the two dots on the production possibility frontier, where I'm giving you various combinations of y and x along the production possibility frontier, which shows the efficiency zone and full utilization of factors of production. Now under Haberler, there are three assumptions. One is two countries, two goods, X and Y, labor and capital are the two inputs. There is no change in technology. There is free trade across nations. There is free and immense amount of trade across nations. There is mobility of capital within country, mobility of labor within country, and you have a case of perfectly competitive markets. Now Haberler, let's look at the assumptions again. Assumption number one is there are two countries participating in trade. Country A and country B. There are two goods, X and Y. Two factors of production, L for labor, K for capital. No change in technology takes place over time. There is free trade between the two countries. There is mobility of labor within the country, but not across countries. Labor is perfectly mobile within a country, but not across countries. And there's perfect competition. Now, these are assumptions on the basis of which trade takes place. And finally, his assumption is opportunity cost differences. It is differences in opportunity costs which sets the parameters and basis for trade. Now, the production possibility frontier. Now, suppose country A has a production possibility frontier of this nature, and which says that given a production possibility frontier ZW, A can produce various combinations of X and Y. I've just shown two combinations here where they're utilizing all the factors of production efficiently. Now, one thing I would like to say here, this is where the concept of opportunity cost comes. Opportunity cost basically means that when you're deploying your resources to produce more of X, you're sacrificing the production of Y. I repeat, please look at this shaded area line which I've put in. For a country A to produce more of X from XO to X1, it has to give up production of Y from Y0 to Y1. And so the sacrifice in terms of production made by not deploying the resources in production of Y, but more of production X, the sacrifice that you're making is called the opportunity cost. Now here, the opportunity cost has many ways of interpreting. Now we'll discuss two cases. The first case is where opportunity cost is constant. It's a straight line. The production possibility frontier can be a straight line if you want. It's a rare case, of course. A straight line, the slope is, or the PPF is a constant. You can see the slope is a constant, which basically says that the opportunity cost is constant. So opportunity cost is constant. In that case, the PPF is a straight line. Now, constant opportunity cost means that the PPF, the slope which is given, remains constant. There is no change in opportunity cost, no matter how much of X extra you're producing by sacrificing Y, which of course is a very rare case, very rare, a straight line PPF, where the opportunity cost is constant. You cannot have an opportunity cost structure which remains constant throughout, because when you're increasing production by sacrificing Y, you can't have the opportunity cost remaining the same. It would vary. Now, why would it vary? Now, normally what we have is this case. This is a scenario where the opportunity cost is what I call increasing. Increasing opportunity cost, and we have a concave structure, production possibility frontier. I'll repeat both the cases again. This is a case where the opportunity cost is constant because the slope of the production possibility curve it doesn't change, and the ZW is a PPF, production possibility frontier. The production possibility curve, a frontier, is a straight line. So straight line and constant opportunity cost, and a concave production possibility curve, which means increasing opportunity costs. In other words, as more and more of X is produced, let's take it to X2 and Y2, you're sacrificing the production of Y to get more and more of X. Now, why is the opportunity cost or sacrifice cost increasing? It is increasing because when you produce excessive quantity of X, your overall cost of production rises because of diminishing returns to scale. I repeat, when you keep producing more and more and more of a particular good X, you end up with diminishing returns to scale. And diminishing returns to scale makes you cost inefficient. So therefore, your opportunity cost rises because you're producing more and more of X and sacrificing the production of Y. Let me repeat it again. What I'm trying to say in this concave function is that as you're producing more and more of X, you're sacrificing more and more of Y. Till you reach a point where, because of diseconomies of scale or diminishing or decreasing returns to scale, where it's not efficient for a country to keep on producing more of a particular good, your cost of production, or rather your average cost of production, rises because of inefficiency. So when you increase X a little bit, see the amount of sacrifice of Y you're doing, tremendous. You're doing a tremendous sacrifice of Y to produce a little bit more of X with this diminishing returns to scale. So the opportunity cost rises. So this is what the shape of the production possibility frontier, or the curve, forms the basis of the opportunity cost differentials. Now, in this lecture, what I would discuss mainly is that when you have constant opportunity cost, trade is very limited. There is virtually no trade. I'll discuss both the cases here. First, when opportunity cost is constant, and second is when opportunity cost is increasing, how nations trade and what are the gains to trade. Right. Now let's move on to the next. We'll try and say, let us take country A here, where you have ZW being the PPF, and you're having Y and X being produced here. Assume that this is the production possibility frontier of country A, which basically says it can produce Y more efficiently. That is what it determines, because country A has a tendency of producing more Y and less of X, because it has a comparative advantage maybe for producing good Y. Similarly, we look at country B, where again country B could look at two commodities X and Y, and here you have country B, and you can have a tendency of seeing more of X being produced. Let's call this ST as the PPF. This is the PPF of country B, and you have a tendency of producing more X because of comparative advantage. Now typically we have two production possibility frontiers, PPF for country A and PPF for country B. And in this we see A has a tendency towards Y and B has a tendency towards X because of comparative cost advantage. Now suppose we have a scenario, if you look at country B, suppose it was consuming at a point E, where it was having, say, YOXO. Suppose without trade, country A, country B, whatever it is, was now in a case of understanding that YOXO is the production and consumption of goods in their respective countries. And with this happening, Now let us see country B now enters with trade with country A. And the terms of trade, the price ratios is similar to country A. Suppose country B starts trading and accepts the price ratio of country A, which is given by ZW. ZW is the production possibility frontier, and this is the price ratio which it accepts. Country B enters into trade. Now what happens? Now suppose this is where it was, country B. And it so happens that with trade, this is now the PPF which it has to accept. If that is the case, what are the gains from trade under this scenario? Well, the gains from trade is very simple to understand, that if you look at a state of affairs where we try and compare country A and country B together under these conditions, and we see that country A and B do not have much gains when the PPF curve is a straight line. There are virtually no gains from trade. There are virtually no gains from trade. And this is where we would need to understand how beneficial is trade under these conditions. The basic idea I would like to draw here to your attention, please focus on this part of the diagram. If you have country A's price ratios as this, and country B's, the ST, I've just superimposed it here to see what happens with country A. Suppose I draw a dotted line and say that the price ratios accepted is given by the dotted line, say let's call this Z1, W1. Let's call this Z1, W1. This is what the terms of trade is, and this is the equilibrium. Let's call this equilibrium C. So initial equilibrium is, say, at point E, YO, XO, but now it has moved up to point C. Now very clearly, if you see this diagram, let's call this part also as M and N. Now to make the diagram less complicated, let us look at the thick line first. That will give you the gains from trade. Mn is what is exported by country B, Mn. And it is imported by country A. So country A imports good X because B has a comparative advantage over good X. So country A would import this quantity. Again, I'm drawing a thicker line. This and this is the same. So it would import this quantity of good X from country B. And in return would be consuming this portion of good X, of which this it consumes domestically and the remaining it exports. It exports the remaining for country A and country B. So therefore, the gains to trade is somewhat limited. In fact, what happens is when you have two equilibriums, point E and point C, and now I've drawn it up to point N, it is very clear that country A is importing Mn of X and exporting this portion to country B, good Y, and consumes the rest. That is exactly what is happening. So there are some marginal gains which happens in the case of A and B, but the gains to trade is somewhat limited. So therefore, this constant opportunity case is not given to you importance. What we will now look at, and please listen to me carefully, is when the opportunity cost is increasing. Let us look at two production possibility curves here. Let's do it for country A, a production possibility curve. We have good X and good Y. And we try to look at a production possibility curve of this nature. This is for country A, increasing opportunity curve. Cost, I told you, it has a concave curve. And similarly for B, we have a different shape of production possibility curve. Let's put X and Y here. Let's have country B here. And as said, country B has a production possibility curve something like this, because it shows it has a slightly more an inclination of producing more X. So country A is of Y and country B is of X. It has a comparative. So that's the shape of the production possibility curve. You tend to produce more of good Y. Country B tends to produce more of good X. Now, to understand a condition of equilibrium now, what I'll be saying is as follows. Suppose we had a scenario of this nature where we are given original points of consumption. We were given original points of consumption. And we would like to see how the scenario would change under these conditions. Supposing country A was producing at this point. It could be producing and consuming at any of the points here. There is absolutely no problem in that. It could be producing at any of the points. And let's look at country B producing at any of the points here along the production possibility curve. Now very clearly, suppose we had the price line which was tangent. Suppose this was the point C in the case of country B, and this was the point for country A. Suppose. Let's assume this. Let's assume this. Let us assume that country A, this was the point, let's call this point D. And for country B, we call it point C. Now, when trade takes place, the terms of trade changes, the price ratios change. And what happens is, the terms of trade changes, and in country A. So, these would be parallel. I'll call this line ST and this line as S1, T1, which would show that, the terms of trade is the same, the price ratios are the same. But now the equilibriums have shifted. Let's call this point L, and let's call this point L1. This is C and D. And now this is C and D, and this is L and L1. So under these conditions, as you can see, the entire production and export concept has changed. Now what happens in the case of country A? What happens in the case of country A? What happens in the case of country A here is that if it earlier was a point at D, it was producing this quantity, say YO and XO. It was producing YO of Y and XO of X. Now what happens is, it is now having X1 of X and Y1 of Y. So in other words, this is what happens. Let me draw a thicker line here to explain what the ratios are here to here. What country A is doing is, it is importing X from country B, OX1. OX1 is what it imports from country B. And what it was consuming earlier, YO, that certainly remains. And the remaining part, this part, is what it is exporting to country B. So country A exports Y to B and imports X from B. I repeat, country A exports Y and imports X from country B, but it exports Y from country A. Whereas, as far as country B is now concerned, if you looked at these points, Y2, X2 and Y1, X1, we clearly see that country B is exporting X and importing Y. So this, instead of producing, it is importing from country A, and the remaining part, it specializes in the production of X and exports X. That is what is happening in this Habermas model of opportunity cost differentials. So therefore, if you look at the two production possibility frontier, the concave, the shape is different because country A has a preference towards Y and country B has a preference towards X. So Habermas concludes that country B would export X and import Y, and country A will export Y and import X. That's what it transpires at this juncture. So very, very critically, this is what country X produces, and this, I think it's a better thing if we name this Y3 and X3. It'll be easier for you to understand. So of the total production, it consumes part of it, and the rest it is exporting. Whereas the Y component, this part, it is importing. And by importing, it produces more of X, which it exports. This is basically now the gains from trade. This is basically the gains from trade, how nations benefit through the gains from trade. And to draw out the real gains from trade, we would like to draw a line. Let's extend this line, and this one here, we call this point, let's call it F, and let's draw this point above, and let's call this point G. Now this is what actually happens. Let's draw this out here. So in other words, if you look at these two particular points here, it is very, very clear what is happening in terms of gains from trade. The gains from trade is very, very clearly illustrated, and it gives an idea that both countries are engaging in trade and there are potential benefits to trade. Now, can I come back to it in the next class because we are running out of time now?